Retirement isn't the end of your usefulness. It is the true beginning of your freedom. Seneca warned us about wasting life. But what if your greatest chapters are yet to be written? Here are 7 Stoic hobbies to keep your mind sharp and your spirit young after 60. For most of our lives, we are tethered to the clocks of other people. We wake to the alarm of our employer. We eat lunch when the schedule permits, and we return home exhausted, offering only the fragmented remnants of our energy to our families and ourselves. Society tells us that retirement is the ultimate finish line, a golden horizon where the only remaining tasks are to lower our handicaps on the golf course, sit on sandy beaches, and gently fade into the twilight of our years. But the Stoics viewed time differently. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, in his brilliant essay on the shortness of life, observed that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. When a person reaches 60, society often whispers that their time is running out. Stoicism, however, shouts that your time has finally become your own. It is not an ending. It is the acquisition of skole, the ancient Greek concept of leisure, which did not mean idle relaxation, but rather time dedicated to study, self-improvement, and philosophical reflection. To understand how to harness this, we must look at the story of Arthur. Arthur retired at 65 after 4 decades as a corporate logistics manager. At his retirement party, he was handed a glass plaque, a firm handshake, and a slice of sheet cake. The following Monday, he woke up at 6 a.m. out of habit, made his coffee, and sat at his kitchen table. The silence of the house was deafening. By noon, a creeping dread had settled into his bones. Who was he, if not the man who solved supply chain crises? Without his emails, his meetings, and his crises, his identity felt like a ghost. This sudden lack of purpose is a modern epidemic, aging retirees faster than any biological clock. Arthur's salvation didn't come from a cruise ship or a television screen, but from a dusty, second-hand bookstore where he stumbled upon the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He learned that the Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the world, didn't find his ultimate purpose in his titles, but in his own character. This led Arthur to his first, and perhaps most vital, retirement hobby. Hobby 1. Philosophical journaling. The evening review. Journaling, in the Stoic sense, is not a diary of events or a ledger of grievances. It is a daily meeting with oneself, a practice of constructing the inner citadel. For a retiree, the mind can easily become a chaotic place, haunted by regrets of the past or anxieties about health and the future. Philosophical journaling acts as a mental broom, sweeping away the cobwebs of anxiety and keeping the mind remarkably elastic and young. Arthur began to practice the evening review, a technique championed by Epictetus. Every night before sleep, Arthur opened a simple, leather-bound notebook and asked himself 3 questions. 1. What did I do amiss today? 2. What did I do right? 3. What duty remains undone? At first, Arthur's journal was filled with frustration. He wrote about his knees aching, his feeling of uselessness, and his irritation at the slow cashier at the grocery store. But as weeks turned into months, the Stoic framework began to rewire his aging brain. By forcing himself to analyze his day objectively, he practiced the dichotomy of control. He realized he could not control the ache in his knees, but he could control his judgment about it. He could not control the fact that he was no longer a corporate manager, but he could control how he managed his current day. This practice keeps the mind young because it requires continuous, active neuroplasticity. You are not passively consuming information. You are actively engaging in self-interrogation. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for publication, but as a private exercise in remaining human amidst the pressures of life. For the modern retiree, journaling becomes a way to remain purposeful amidst the vacuum of a quiet schedule. Arthur began to wake up, not with a sense of dread, but with a sense of philosophical curiosity. He started writing morning pages as well, preparing for the day with premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. He would write, "Today I may encounter someone who is ungrateful, a body that is slow, or a circumstance that is frustrating. But none of these can harm my ruling center." By documenting his mind, Arthur found that his spirit felt lighter, more agile, and deeply resilient. He was no longer aging passively. He was actively designing his emotional landscape. The pen became his sword against the decay of purpose. Through journaling, the retiree learns that the greatest adventure left is not exploring the world, but exploring the vast, uncharted territories of the inner self. If journaling meticulously fortifies the inner citadel, then deliberate physical movement fortifies its outer walls. A pervasive, modern misconception about Stoicism is that it is a philosophy strictly of the mind, a purely intellectual exercise that ignores or even disdains the physical body. But the ancient Stoics were active, vigorous participants in the physical world. Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, was a former pugilist who paid for his daytime philosophical studies by hauling heavy buckets of water for gardens at night. Epictetus, who spent much of his life with a physical disability, taught that the body is a vessel, a temporary, fragile assignment from nature that we must maintain with fierce dignity, even as we gracefully accept its inevitable decline. As we cross the threshold of 60, the physical body demands a radically different kind of attention. The reckless, infinite energy of youth fades, replaced by the strict requirement for deliberate, mindful stewardship. Society often tells seniors to simply sit down, to take it easy, and to fear their own physical fragility. But to keep the spirit young and defiant, one must keep the physical vessel engaged, not out of a vain desire to recapture one's 20s, but through a reverent duty to nature and oneself. This brings us to the story of Eleanor and two deeply Stoic physical pursuits. Eleanor was 62 when a routine mid-year doctor's visit shattered her reality. A former high school literature teacher, she had spent the vast majority of her life indoors, sitting hunched over mahogany desks, grading endless stacks of essays. Her life was a life of the mind, completely disconnected from her physical form. Under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights of the clinic, her doctor pointed to a stark black and white bone density scan. The diagnosis was creeping osteoporosis, coupled with stubbornly elevated blood pressure. The news terrified her. She felt profoundly betrayed by her body, viewing it as a failing, rusty machine over which she had completely lost control. The fear of a sudden fall, of breaking a hip and losing her independence, became an all-consuming obsession. She fell into a thick, depressive lethargy, spending her days completely sedentary on the living room couch, watching the world pass through the window pane, feeling like a crumbling ruin waiting to collapse. It wasn't until a concerned former colleague practically dragged her out of the house to a local community philosophy discussion group that the fog began to lift. There, she encountered a reading of Epictetus, who famously declared, "Sickness is a hindrance to the body, but not to your ability to choose, unless that is your choice. Lameness is a hindrance to the leg, but not to your ability to choose." The words struck Eleanor like lightning. She realized that while she could not magically cure her aging, thinning bones, she was entirely, 100% in control of how she responded to them. She chose to fight back. She would not fight with desperate, expensive attempts to recapture her youth, but with demanding hobbies that forcefully aligned her physical reality with the raw power of the natural world. Hobby 2. Mindful rucking and walking in nature. Eleanor took up walking, but she refused to engage in the distracted, podcast-listening, hurried walking of the modern suburbanite. She embraced the Stoic practice of mindful walking, and, after reading about the mechanical stresses required to build bone density, she added a weighted backpack to her routine. This practice, known as rucking, transformed a simple stroll into a load-bearing exercise of endurance. In Stoicism, there is a beautiful, anchoring concept called sympatheia, the fundamental belief in the mutual interdependence and living connection of all things in the universe. By walking mindfully through the dense forests and steep dirt trails of a nearby state park, Eleanor began to physically experience this profound connection. She did not wear headphones. She listened to the crunch of gravel under her boots and the wind moving through the canopy. She observed the deep, gnarled roots of the ancient oak trees, noting how they weathered violent storms, not by being perfectly rigid, but by being deeply anchored and adaptable. Walking with heavy weight requires immense physical endurance, a primary Stoic virtue. When her leg muscles ached, her shoulders protested the heavy straps, and her lungs burned on a steep, unforgiving incline, Eleanor did not retreat to the couch. Instead, she practiced the psychological art of objective representation. The pain in her calves was just a biological sensation. It was not bad or evil. It was merely the friction of her body adapting and growing stronger. She repeated a mantra inspired by Marcus Aurelius: "The obstacle is the way." The steep, muddy hill was not blocking her path to health. The resistance of the hill was the path. This demanding hobby keeps a person young, because it aggressively combats the physical and psychological shrinking that often accompanies aging. It promotes robust cardiovascular health, forces the skeletal system to fortify itself, and, most importantly, gets the retiree out of the artificial, climate-controlled confines of the house. It throws them into the vast, indifferent, yet breathtaking theater of nature. It teaches the aging body that it can still endure, adapt, and conquer. Hobby 3. Stoic gardening. The practice of amor fati. As her physical strength and stamina returned through rucking, Eleanor sought a way to connect even more intimately with the earth. She decided to tear up a large portion of her pristine, sterile suburban lawn and transform it into a sprawling, labor-intensive vegetable and flower garden. Gardening is perhaps the most perfect, tangible manifestation of the Stoic dichotomy of control. When you build and plant a garden, you are firmly in control of the painstaking preparation. You can obsessively test and amend the soil's pH, meticulously pull the invasive weeds, plant the organic seeds at the precise depth recommended, and water them with diligent devotion. But once the seed is in the earth, you are completely and utterly at the mercy of the universe for the outcome. You cannot control the late spring frost that bites the tender leaves, the sudden invasion of aphids, the torrential summer floods, or the scorching, drought-inducing sun. In her second year of rigorous gardening, Eleanor planted a beautiful, carefully curated row of Cherokee purple heirloom tomatoes. She tended to them daily, carefully tying their heavy vines to wooden stakes and pinching off their suckers. By midsummer, they had grown toweringly tall and bore heavy, vibrant green fruit that was just beginning to blush purple. She was immensely proud of her work. Then, on a sweltering late July afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickening shade of green. A sudden, violent, freak hailstorm struck. In 20 agonizing minutes, her prized, carefully tended tomato plants were ruthlessly shredded to the ground by ice the size of marbles. Before her philosophical awakening, Eleanor would have wept in frustration, cursed her terrible luck, and perhaps abandoned the messy, heartbreaking hobby altogether. But standing in the muddy, devastated ruin of her backyard the following morning, she actively practiced amor fati, a fierce, unconditional love of one's fate. She recognized that the storm was simply an indifferent act of nature. To be angry at the weather is to be angry at the universe itself, which the Stoics deemed completely irrational and a waste of precious energy. The universe willed it to hail, she told herself, looking at the bruised fruit in the mud. And so I will the hail to be exactly as it is. She did not wallow. She systematically cleaned up the debris, salvaged the few unblemished green tomatoes to ripen on her windowsill, and took the shredded vines to the compost bin, literally turning her tragedy into fertilizer for the future. She immediately began preparing the freshly turned soil for an autumn harvest of hearty kale, thick carrots, and resilient root vegetables. Gardening kept Eleanor fiercely young because it forced her to remain endlessly hopeful and perpetually forward-looking. A true gardener is always planning for the next season, no matter what disaster befell the last. It physically grounded her hands in the dirt, serving as a gentle, beautiful memento mori. Remember, you must die. The undeniable cycle of the garden, miraculous birth in the spring, vibrant, chaotic life in the summer, inevitable decay in the autumn, and quiet death in the winter, perfectly mirrors the human life. By intimately participating in this cycle rather than hiding from it, Eleanor made profound peace with her own autumn. She learned firsthand that there is distinct beauty and essential purpose in every single season, and that aging is simply the abundant harvest of a life well tended. The Stoic does not retreat from the world to merely perfect themselves in isolation. We are, as Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself, made for each other. For we are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. To act against one another then is contrary to nature. The Stoics believed in the concept of the cosmopolis, the great universal city of humanity in which every single person has a role to play, regardless of their age or physical condition. As one crosses into their 60s, society often inadvertently pushes the elderly to the margins. They are implicitly told to step aside, to enjoy their pensions in quiet solitude, and to let the younger, more energetic generations run the machinery of the world. This isolation, however well-intentioned, is a spiritual death sentence. To stay young, one must remain an active, contributing member of the human hive. Furthermore, to prevent the mind from calcifying, one must continually subject it to the friction of being a beginner. The ego is the ultimate enemy of youthfulness. When we stop learning because we believe we have already acquired all the wisdom we need, our minds instantly begin to age. Consider the story of Thomas. For 35 years, Thomas was a senior structural engineer for a massive commercial firm. He was the man with the absolute answers. When he walked into a conference room, junior architects deferred to his expertise. He dealt in the undeniable laws of physics, load-bearing calculations, and the tensile strength of steel. When he retired at 68, he lost more than his salary. He lost his podium, his team, and his undisputed authority. Without blueprints to review or crises to manage, Thomas found himself adrift. He began wandering the aisles of local hardware stores, pacing the lumber sections. He would spot young, inexperienced couples trying to choose materials for a weekend project and swoop in, offering unsolicited, highly technical advice. He desperately tried to cling to his identity as the expert, lecturing bewildered shoppers about load distribution. Instead of feeling helpful, he was becoming bitter and resentful, feeling that his hard-earned wisdom was rotting on the vine, unappreciated by a world that had seemingly moved on without him. The turning point arrived on his 69th birthday, when his daughter, noticing his growing irritability, gifted him a translated volume of Seneca's Letters from a Stoic. Thomas sat in his favorite armchair and opened to a letter where Seneca gently chastised his friend Lucilius for resting on his laurels. Seneca wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. He realized he had stopped learning entirely. He was only trying to dictate. He had allowed his ego to convince him that his past achievements excused him from present growth. He needed to find a way to serve others without the thick armor of his corporate title, and more importantly, he needed to humble his rigid mind by becoming a novice once again. Hobby 4. Embracing the role of the mentor. Thomas decided to volunteer at a local, underfunded community center, signing up to teach basic math and life skills to at-risk teenagers. The environment was a profound shock to his highly ordered system. These teenagers didn't care that he used to design suspension bridges or that he once managed a team of 50 engineers. They didn't care about his impressive resume, his past salary, or his authoritative tone. They only cared if he was authentic, patient, and genuinely interested in their well-being. Mentorship is a deeply Stoic hobby because it is an exercise in pure cosmopolitanism. It is the vital transfer of wisdom from the winter of one life to the spring of another, fulfilling the Stoic duty to the collective whole. However, Thomas quickly learned that true mentorship is not about lecturing from a place of superiority. It is about guiding by empathetic example. During his third week, he was tutoring a 15-year-old boy named Leo. Leo was struggling with a basic algebra worksheet. Frustration boiled over, and Leo suddenly cursed, slammed his fists on the table, and threw his workbook across the room, scattering papers everywhere. Thomas's old corporate instinct, the instinct of the senior manager, was to reprimand the boy severely for insubordination and disrespect. His face flushed with anger, but applying Stoic temperance, Thomas caught himself. He paused, creating a space between the stimulus and his response. He recognized that Leo's anger was not an attack on him. It was a manifestation of the boy's own internal chaos, his fear of failure, and a home life devoid of stability. Thomas took a slow breath, walked across the room, and calmly picked up the workbook. He sat back down next to the defiant boy and said quietly, "I used to get incredibly angry when the math didn't fit together perfectly too. It makes you feel out of control, doesn't it? Let's look at the pieces together." By stepping down from his pedestal and becoming a compassionate mentor, Thomas regained a profound sense of purpose. This hobby kept his spirit young because it forcibly connected him to the raw, pulsating, and chaotic energy of youth. It bridged the generational divide that so often isolates the elderly. For Thomas, seeing the spark of understanding eventually light up in Leo's eyes was infinitely more rewarding than seeing any blueprint come to life. He was no longer building structures of steel and concrete. He was helping to engineer human resilience. Hobby 5. Learning a difficult, unforgiving skill. Woodworking and craftsmanship. While mentorship brilliantly fulfilled his duty to others and softened his heart, Thomas knew he still needed a way to tame his ego and rigorously challenge his aging brain. He needed a daily reminder of what it felt like to not possess all the answers. He decided to clear out half of his garage and take up traditional, hand tool woodworking. No power tools, no lasers, just saws, chisels, and hand planes. Woodworking is an inherently Stoic discipline. It requires an absolute, humbling submission to objective reality. You cannot talk a piece of solid white oak into being straight. You cannot use your past resume, your age, or your former authority to convince a dovetailed joint to fit together. If your chisel is dull, the wood will aggressively tear. If your measurements are rushed, the glaring gap will show. The wood is entirely indifferent to your ego. It responds only to truth, patience, and applied skill. In the beginning, Thomas was a disaster. He ruined piece after piece of expensive hardwood. His cuts were crooked, his joints were humiliatingly loose, and his soft hands quickly blistered. For a man who was used to being a flawless master of his domain, being a clumsy, incompetent beginner was deeply, intensely frustrating. There were days he wanted to throw his tools across the garage, much like Leo had thrown his workbook. But this intense frustration was exactly the cognitive medicine his mind required. The Stoic practice of confronting difficulty voluntarily, voluntary discomfort, builds supreme mental fortitude. Thomas was forced to slow down. He learned to appreciate the sensory details he had ignored for decades. The sharp scent of cedar, the metallic ring of sharpening a blade on a whetstone, and the rhythmic, meditative sound of a hand plane shaving a micromillimeter of wood. He learned the Stoic virtue of prosocia, or sustained, mindful attention to the present moment. He could not worry about the past or the future while wielding a razor-sharp chisel. He had to be entirely in the now. Neurologically, when we force our brains to learn a complex, physically demanding new skill, we physically alter our brain chemistry. We trigger the production of myelin, the critical insulation around our nerve fibers, effectively keeping the brain's neural pathways young, firing, and agile. By accepting his lowly status as a beginner, Thomas found a strange, deeply liberating joy. He wasn't the master engineer in his dusty garage. He was just a humble student of the wood. Months later, when he finally carved a complex dovetailed joint that fit together perfectly, tight, seamless, and strong without the need for a single drop of glue, the satisfaction was uniquely pure. He had created order out of chaos through his own sustained, mindful effort. Woodworking taught him the ultimate lesson of a Stoic retirement. Growth does not stop when a career inevitably ends. Growth stops only when we arrogantly refuse to pick up a new set of tools. While physical movement and community service keep the body and the ego in a state of healthy balance, there remains the vast, quiet, and often intimidating expanse of unstructured time that every retiree must eventually face alone. When the house is silent, the garden is tended, and the tasks of the day are complete, the human mind, left to its own devices, can easily slip into dark rumination. It is in these quiet hours that we must aggressively address the ultimate illusion of aging, the deeply ingrained societal belief that because our biological future is growing shorter, our internal world must necessarily grow smaller and narrower. Seneca, in his brilliant and fiery letters to his friend Lucilius, argued fiercely against this tragic shrinking of the world. He believed that the uneducated or unreflective person is tightly bound by the narrow, suffocating confines of their own brief chronological lifespan, but the philosopher, the seeker of wisdom, has unfettered access to all of human history. Of all people, only those are at leisure who make time for philosophy. Only they truly live, Seneca wrote, defining the true meaning of retirement. Not satisfied to merely keep good watch over their own days, they annex every age to their own. all the harvest of the past is added to their store. To fully understand how to practically annex the ages and conquer the ticking clock, we turn to the story of Margaret. Margaret was 66, a recently retired, highly successful commercial real estate broker. Her entire adult life had been a frantic, adrenaline-fueled blur of high-stakes negotiations, complex property valuations, endless networking events, and lavish closing dinners. Her fundamental identity was entirely tethered to the constant buzzing of her smartphone and the color-coded blocks on her digital calendar. She was a woman of action, defined by her output. When she retired, the sudden, absolute cessation of this external validation hit her nervous system like a physical blow. The transition was brutal. She woke up on a Tuesday morning to a calendar that was entirely blank. She tried desperately to fill the terrifying void with modern distractions. Hours of daytime television, scrolling mindlessly through social media to watch younger colleagues take over her old territory, and wandering aimlessly through upscale shopping malls. But she quickly found that modern, passive entertainment didn't nourish her. It only numbed her. The constant stream of digital dopamine left a bitter aftertaste. She felt her once razor-sharp mind growing dull, her legendary conversational skills atrophying into complaints about the weather, and a pervasive, creeping boredom taking root deep in her soul. She felt rapidly older, not because her body was failing her, but because her mind was actively starving in a desert of superficiality. Her profound transformation began on a rainy Tuesday, when she sought refuge in a local art and history museum. Wandering through an exhibit on ancient Greece, she read a small placard featuring a quote by Zeno of Citium, the founding father of Stoic philosophy. The placard explained that when Zeno was a young, shipwrecked man, lost and devoid of purpose, he consulted the famous oracle of Delphi to ask how he should live his best life. The oracle gave him a haunting, cryptic answer: take on the complexion of the dead. Zeno interpreted this not as a morbid command to physically die or to visit graveyards, but as a brilliant instruction to read the ancients, to seek out books, and converse intimately with the greatest minds of the past who had already navigated the treacherous waters of human existence. Triangle source, deep reading and the practice of marginalia, the conversation with the dead. Inspired, Margaret decided to abandon her mindless digital scrolling and take up the demanding hobby of deep, intentional reading. But she did not reach for light, escapist beach fiction, or modern self-help books promising quick fixes. She wanted to read the foundational, enduring texts of human thought, history, classical philosophy, and ancient literature. She started with the titans of Stoicism, Epictetus, Seneca, and the journals of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Deep reading, in the Stoic sense, is never passive consumption. It is not letting words wash over you while you half watch a screen. It is an active, vigorous, intellectual wrestling match with the text. Margaret bought heavy, physical hardcover books, a set of archival highlighters, and a high-quality fountain pen. She committed to the ancient scholarly practice of marginalia, writing her own thoughts, counter-arguments, and deeply personal reflections directly in the margins of the pages. When she carefully read Seneca's essay on the shortness of life, she aggressively underlined the passage where he stated that while we cannot choose the family we are born into, we are allowed to freely choose our own intellectual parents. We can choose to be adopted by the great thinkers of history. Margaret mentally adopted Seneca as her personal mentor. When she slowly passed through Marcus Aurelius's meditations, she read his private thoughts on the fleeting, vaporous nature of fame and the utter foolishness of seeking the applause of fickle crowds. She paused, uncapped her pen, and wrote in the margins next to the emperor's words, "This is exactly how I felt chasing the top regional broker award in 2015. I sacrificed a year of sleep for a piece of glass. It meant absolutely nothing the morning after I won it, yet I let it define my worth. This rigorous hobby acts as a literal fountain of youth for the aging mind for several profound reasons. First, it completely obliterates the agonizing feeling of senior isolation. Through deep reading, Margaret realized that her modern fears of irrelevance, her midnight anxieties about health, and her lingering regrets about past career compromises were not unique to her. They were the exact same human struggles faced by all-powerful Roman emperors, exiled statesmen, and Greek slaves facing execution. To read deeply is to realize that you are part of a grand, unbroken chain of human experience. You are never truly alone if you have a library. You are simply sitting in a grand symposium, waiting for you to join the debate. Secondly, this practice vigorously exercises the brain's capacity for sustained, deep focus. In a modern world defined by 10-second videos and hopelessly fragmented attention spans, sitting in a quiet, sunlit room for 2 solid hours to decode and internalize a complex, translated philosophical argument requires intense cognitive stamina. Over the span of 6 months, Margaret felt her attention span dramatically lengthening, her vocabulary expanding, and her memory sharpening to its former edge. She was actively rebuilding her cognitive reserves and strengthening neural pathways. Most importantly, deep reading fundamentally shifted her relationship with the concept of time. She stopped agonizing over the biological fact that she was 66 years old. When you spend your Tuesday afternoons walking through the ancient stoas of Athens with Socrates, or standing on the muddy, freezing battlefields of Germania, conversing with Marcus Aurelius, your own chronological age ceases to matter. You step entirely outside of linear time and enter the eternal, vibrant present of human wisdom. Margaret's social interactions transformed as well. Her conversations with friends shifted away from the mundane complaints about aches, pains, and local neighborhood gossip, blossoming into vibrant, challenging discussions about history, ethics, virtue, and human nature. By taking on the complexion of the dead and daring to converse with ghosts, Margaret's mind became more radiantly alive, ferociously curious, and brilliantly youthful than it had been during the peak of her frantic career. She had learned how to annex the ages, ensuring her world would only continue to expand until her final day. If deep reading expands our connection to human history, there is one final frontier the aging Stoic must confront: our place in the vast, indifferent cosmos and the inevitable reality of our own mortality. Modern society goes to extraordinary lengths to hide death. We compartmentalize it, sanitize it, and use every anti-aging cream, surgery, and supplement available to pretend it is not approaching. But the Stoics viewed this denial as a source of immense suffering. They believed that to live fully, one must keep the reality of death constantly in mind. Memento mori. Only by accepting that our time is finite can we truly value the present moment. To bridge the gap between the earthly concerns of aging and the majestic reality of the universe, we look to David. David was a 71-year-old retired cardiologist. For 40 years, his entire existence was dedicated to fighting death. In the sterile, brightly lit environment of the operating room, he played a high-stakes game against mortality, repairing failing hearts and buying his patients more time. But when he finally retired, the armor of his profession fell away. He developed a mild heart condition of his own. The man who had spent his life saving others suddenly realized he could not save himself. David became paralyzed by health anxiety. He checked his pulse obsessively. Every minor ache was interpreted as the end. His fear of death was casting a dark, suffocating shadow over his retirement, aging him rapidly with chronic stress. Relief did not come from more medical tests, but from a profound Stoic exercise known as macroscopia, the view from above. Marcus Aurelius frequently urged himself to take a step back from his earthly anxieties and view life from a cosmic perspective. You can rid yourself of many useless things among those that disturb you, for they lie entirely in your imagination, and you will then gain for yourself ample space by comprehending the whole universe in your mind and by contemplating the eternity of time. David decided to manifest this philosophical exercise into a tangible hobby. Hobby 7. Amateur astronomy and the contemplation of the cosmos. David purchased a high-quality telescope and began studying amateur astronomy. He learned to track the constellations, identify the planets, and locate deep sky objects. Night after night, he would stand in his backyard, bundled against the cold, and gaze into the staggering abyss of the universe. Astronomy is the ultimate Stoic pursuit because it fundamentally demands humility. When David focused his lens on the Andromeda galaxy, he was looking at light that had traveled for 2.5 million years just to reach his eye. He was looking back in time. He observed the craters on the moon, untouched by wind or water for billions of years. He watched the rings of Saturn, a beautiful, silent dance of ice and rock, suspended in the freezing vacuum of space. Through the eyepiece of his telescope, David's earthly anxieties began to dissolve. How could he obsess over the minor ache in his left shoulder when he was bearing witness to the birth and death of stars? How could he fear his own insignificance when he realized that the very iron in his blood and the calcium in his bones were forged in the heart of dying supernovas? He was not separate from the universe, destined to be discarded by it. He was a conscious piece of the universe, looking back at itself. This practice of macroscopia keeps the spirit fiercely young by reigniting childlike wonder. As we age, the world often becomes mundane. We feel we have seen it all, but astronomy reminds us that we are floating on a tiny, fragile blue speck in an ocean of infinite mystery. It is impossible to be a cynical, bitter old man when you are hunting for the Orion Nebula in the winter sky. Furthermore, astronomy cured David of his paralyzing fear of death. The Stoics taught that death is simply a dissolution back into the elements from which we came. It is not an evil. It is a law of nature. By spending his nights observing the grand, eternal machinery of the cosmos, David made peace with his own temporary nature. He realized that his life, though incredibly brief in the cosmic scale, was a rare and beautiful privilege. Instead of checking his pulse in fear, he began to use his remaining time with immense gratitude. He woke up every morning thrilled simply to exist, to breathe the air, and to witness another day. His heart condition remained, but his suffering vanished. By looking up at the eternal stars, David found the ultimate cure for the anxieties of aging, the absolute acceptance of his place in the universe. Retirement is not a waiting room for the end. It is the arena where your finest philosophical work begins. Whether through journaling, rucking, gardening, mentoring, woodworking, deep reading, or stargazing, the Stoic path keeps the mind vibrant and the spirit unyielding. Which of these 7 hobbies will you choose to build your inner citadel? Let me know in the comments below. If you found value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more Stoic wisdom.